I just got back from Brazil, where on April 17th, the Chamber of Deputies, which is their House of Representatives, the lower house, voted to begin impeachment proceedings against President Dilma Rousseff. Dilma is accused of some accounting trickery, which I'll discuss more in a little bit. The next steps, just so everybody understands the process in Brazil, according to their constitution, is that the matter is now referred to the Senate, and where the Senate then has an initial vote as to whether to proceed with a trial, and that's a simple majority vote of the Senate. If they proceed to a trial, then Dilma is suspended from office for 180 days, which means that the vice president, a guy named Michel Temer, assumes power. Now, Temer and Rousseff are of different political parties. She is with the Workers' Party, or the PT, and Temer is with the Brazilian Democratic Movement, the PMDB, a center-right party. The PT would now be considered more left or center-left, but progressive. If the Senate, by a 2/3 vote, convicts her at the trial, she is removed permanently from office. If they don't hold a trial within 180 days, or she is not found guilty by a 2/3 vote, then she is back in office. Now, April 17th is an important day in Brazilian history, and not just because it was the impeachment. And I was in Brazil on that day specifically, not because I was prescient enough to figure out if that there was going to be an impeachment vote. But on April 17th, 1996, a group of about 1,000 men and women from the Movimento Sem Terra, which is the Brazilian Landless Workers Movement, a peasant movement struggling for agrarian reform and land, were marching from the south in the state of Pará, and they were marching from the south up to the state capital, which is in Belém. At a curve, an S-curve on the highway, they stopped for a rest and uppulled from both directions busloads of state military police who unloaded from the buses and immediately opened fire with automatic weapons, killing 19 landless and injuring dozens more. Because of the 150 police involved, not one person in the 20 years has served 1 day in jail. Rural violence, which is part of what we're going to talk about a little bit today, has been endemic for the MST. So this is the results of the massacre of Eldorado dos Carajás in 1996. Those are the coffins of the dead, transporting them, and of course the people grieving over their departed. So we're going to discuss the political situation in Brazil tonight, but in order to do so, I'm going to have to give you a little bit of history, because in order to understand what's happening today in Brazil, we have to go back in time. And in 1960, the fellow named Jânio Quadros was elected as president, and a man named João Goulart, known popularly as Django, was elected vice president. Now, like Temer and Dilma, Quadros and Django were from different political parties. In 1961, while Django was out of the country on state business, Quadros resigned his office as president. Now, normally Django would have succeeded immediately, but he was out of the country, and which left an opening, which was, people thought he probably resigned on purpose at that time, for the military to move forward and install a new president. Well, Django was returned to the country, and after 2 years of struggle, was able to reestablish the democracy in 1963. They actually call that the Second Republic in Brazil. Now, Django was a leftist, and he promoted greater state intervention in the economy. He wanted to tax the profits of multinational corporations. He wanted to establish relationships with various communist countries around the world. And most importantly, he advocated and pushed through a bill to expropriate all unproductive land and farms over 1,500 acres, which would have been thousands of acres, and turn that land over to the landless peasants who could then use it productively. This expropriation program wasn't just his idea. Of course, the peasant leagues at the time were rarely strong, and the peasant leagues had pushed for this bill, and it was passed and was going to be implemented. But on March 31st, 1964, the generals ordered their troops to march onto Rio de Janeiro to depose Jango. Troops surrounded the national capital. There's tanks in front of the capital in Brasilia. That's on one of the main boulevards in Rio de Janeiro. And that's occupying what was the presidential palace before Brasilia was constructed. Almost immediately, the Supreme Court of Brazil legalized the coup, and I say that in quotes, of course, and the Speaker of the House was sworn in as president. They, under false pretenses that Jango was not in the country. There's solid evidence, and more has come to light recently, of U.S. involvement in this coup. The U.S. ambassador to Brazil, a fellow named Lincoln Gordon, had consistently and without evidence told the State Department and President Johnson that Jango was allied with the Brazilian Communist Party. The U.S., of course, was wary of another Cuba and ordered the Navy to position an aircraft carrier group off the shore of Brazil and readied to transport at request 110 tons of ammunition and tear gas in support of the Brazilian military. Recent documents also show that the CIA, which is headed by John McCone and urged on by McCone's closest friend, a fellow named Harold Guinan, who was president of International Telephone and Telegraph, who, if those of you who studied Latin American history, has a notorious, that company has a notorious role in overthrowing democratic governments throughout the continent, throughout all of Latin America, to assist the coup efforts. Already the CIA had been involved. They had issued a steady stream of propaganda about Jango to the media, which ate it up and pushed it out, and they had pumped lots of money into the Agency for International Development and the AFL-CIO to destabilize the government. So the coup was successful. Jango fled, and there was some resistance immediately, but things settled down fairly fast. During the military, we don't have time to discuss what happened during the military dictatorship. I'm just going to make three points. First, there was an increase in industrialization and urbanization at that point, with many families moving from the poverty-stricken northeast of the country for industrial jobs in and around Sao Paulo, including a fellow named Lula, who we'll talk about in a little bit. The foreign policy was made completely subservient to U.S. foreign policy. Anybody the U.S. didn't want to have relationships with, Brazil broke off relationships with. However, the guise of democracy was maintained, and there was established a pro-coup party called the National Renewal Alliance, or ARENA, and and they created an opposition party, the Brazilian Democratic Movement, the MDB. Now, these parties were popularly known throughout Brazil as the Yes and the Yes Sir parties. It's interesting to note that if you talk to Brazilians who were alive and had any political awareness during that time, and ask them to define what dictatorship means, they will tell you without hesitation that it means a system of government where there's two bourgeois political parties and that's it. So think about that. So the dictatorship really began to end in the late 70s and was formally ended with the adoption of a new Congress in new Constitution, in 1988. Initially, under the dictatorship, the economy grew rapidly. It grew at 10% a year during the first about 8 to 10 years of the dictatorship. However, with the increase of both the internal and the external debt, a larger portion of the resources went to debt service, and the economy slowed, unemployment increased, and as we talked about, the IMF demanded wage suppression. So the austerity push triggered strikes throughout the country, led by Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, known as Lula, this gentleman here, during the period 78 to 82. He led the auto workers strike and massive walkouts, crippling the production throughout the entire industry, most of which is centered around Sao Paulo. The other internal factor, another internal factor was the direct elections movement, which captivated not just the working class, but broad sectors of the middle class, which of course at that time was incredibly small. But still, it did capture them. And so Brazil has had, until the new Constitution in 1980, an electoral college system. So the presidents weren't elected by direct vote. They're elected by the electors of the Electoral College. So this movement called for direct elections now garnered vast support, as you can see in some of the pictures. So throughout all sectors of the Brazilian society. So the restoration of democracy was imminent. Also in 1980, the Workers' Party, the Partido dos Trabalhadores, the PT, was formed. The PT consisted of trade unionists, left-wing intellectuals, and Catholics associated with the liberation theology movement. Lula was one of its leaders. So here's some of the meetings, showing some of the meetings, the formation of the PT. There was also armed resistance throughout the entire period, but mostly centered in urban areas and mostly undertaken by students, or actually ex-students. The most active period of the armed resistance was 73 to 76, but it continued on, like I said, well into the late 80s. One of the most dominant forms of armed action was the kidnapping of foreign ambassadors to require the release of comrades who were imprisoned. And the most famous one, of course, was the kidnapping of the U.S. ambassador. And that was made famous. There's a movie called 4 Days in September starring Alan Arkin, which, it's a Hollywood version of it. There's more of a documentary, but I don't know that I think it's only in Portuguese. Dilma was a guerrilla. She was a fighter. She picked up arms. She came from a more middle-class background and was a student at the time of the imposition of the dictatorship, and then, of course, went underground to fight. In the late 70s, during all this strike, during some continued armed violence, the formation of the Workers' Party, the direct election movement, the president at that time decided they needed to begin opening up the process to return to some form of democracy. So they opened up and they allowed the return of political exiles, repeal of some of the draconian laws. And by 1984, the generals decided it was better to negotiate an end to the dictatorship with an amnesty for themselves rather than face firing squads. In 1988, they adopted the Constitution. In 2002, Lula was elected president on his fourth try. Now, the PT had transformed itself from a socialist party to more of a European-style social democratic party, which probably was part of the key to its election in 2002. The PT government instituted a wide variety of social programs, including Bolsa Familia, which is a basic income guarantee, Zero Fome, which is an anti-hunger campaign, and a 70% increase in the minimum wage. The social programs were instrumental in lifting over 30 million people out of abject poverty to at least some level of income, food, and housing security. In essence, it's hard to describe, but in essence, Lula instituted what a sort of a hybrid economy, a neoliberal, neo-developmental economy, with the neoliberal part, of course, allowing the foreign and international corporations and the large landlords to continue on with their ways of exploitation, but also forcing them to allow lots of money to go into social programs to develop the economy and also to develop the working class. So under Lula, the social programs provided a demand stimulus, and there was a loosening of domestic credit. So Brazilians who were able to borrowed money, purchased cars, other durable goods, mostly manufactured in Brazil, and housing. So the economy really boomed during the 8 years Lula was in power. The economy was in large part, though, really fueled by exports. 46% of the exports were raw materials, consisting of agricultural goods like soy and minerals such as iron ore. Exports were it broke down, the three major purchasers were China, about 19% of all exports, the U.S. at 13%, and Argentina at 7%. Exports peaked at about $25 billion in 2011, but had fallen by 2015 to $15 billion. Foreign investment continued to increase, especially in the agricultural sector. From 2007 to 2011, there was $400 billion in foreign investment in Brazil. And the other factor that during Lula's term of office was the discovery of vast deposits of oil offshore. Petrobras is the state-owned Brazilian company, and they are the ones in control of leasing it and so forth and so on. The discovery of this oil fueled a corruption scandal, a vast corruption scandal, which is still going on. The discovery and the pursuit of it is known in English as Operation Car Wash, because there was all this money being laundered. So Dilma was elected in 2010 with 58% of the vote. So Brazil has a governmental system very similar to ours. There's an executive branch headed by the president. There's a Congress with a lower house and upper house, so there's a proportional representation throughout the 27 states, and then there's 3 senators from each state for a total of 81 senators. But since it's not a parliamentary system, and there's 15 viable parties running at any given time, in any given election, they have to make alliances in order to get blocks of alliances in order to get anything through Congress, because there's usually no one party that holds a majority in of itself. So this was the alliance that the PT put together, and they were able to hold a majority in both houses. So Dilma was elected in 2010 with 56% of the vote. The economy had expanded in that year of 7.5%, and the national bourgeoisie continued to support the neoliberal, neo-developmental model. But clouds were on the horizon. So the car wash scandal began to consume more of the public consciousness. These hundreds of millions of dollars of kickbacks from construction companies and others seeking government contracts. Prior to becoming president, Dilma was the head of Petrobras, as a government employee. So she immediately became associated with the scandal. Although there's never been any evidence, and there's still never been any evidence, that she ever took one penny for herself, either directly or indirectly. But her election was what really set off the right wing. They couldn't understand, just like Romney couldn't understand, how Dilma beat them, or in Romney's case, how Obama had beaten him. And fearful that Lula may have decided to come back and run for president in 2018, which the Constitution permits. You're only disallowed 2 consecutive terms. You get 2 consecutive terms, then you have to leave, and then you can come back and go for 2 more consecutive terms. There's no overall limitation like our Constitution. And they were concerned that they needed to begin, so they launched an offensive. So the offensive actually was launched in 2013 when Sao Paulo and a number of other cities raised fares on public transportation. Fueled by the hegemonic global media empire, demonstrations for fare decreases became a launching pad for neo-fascist demands for Dilma's removal. After Dilma's re-election, Globo is an omnipresent media company. They control the main television networks, they control the all main radio stations, and they control most of the major newspapers and magazines. So they began a campaign against her, trying to tie her to the corruption and the corruption in the PT. Now there was plenty of corruption in the PT. Even though they had always run on the fact that they were clean, they had entered into American style. Brazil had entered into American style electoral politics, and you needed to fund the campaigns. So campaign donations were plentiful, and bribery, etc. So this is a fairly astounding fact, fully 60% of the 594 members of Brazil's Congress face serious charges of bribery, electoral fraud, illegal deforestation, kidnapping, and homicide. 60%. Globo fostered these demonstrations, and there's a sort of classic. Glenn Greenwald did an amazing piece on his website, Insight, analyzing the class nature of the demonstrations of these middle class and upper middle class demonstrations. This picture sort of spread like wildfire throughout Brazil. So these folks are walking in the demonstration, the people in the green and yellow striped shirts. But of course, they can't even be bothered to stroll with their child. They have to have the child's nanny walk behind them. So this was the class nature of the demonstrations fostered by Globo and picked up, of course, by the right wing. After the government accounting office discovered that Dilma had moved funds from state banks to cover shortfalls in the government programs, Globo launched an impeachment campaign. Now, claiming that Dilma did this to cover up the extent of the budget deficit prior to the election so that she would could get reelected, the most reactionary members of Congress saw an opening. The problem for the pro-coup forces is that these accounting irregularities do not form the basis for impeachment under the Constitution, especially since the funds were repaid when the tax revenues were received, and no one, as I've said, no one's ever claimed that Dilma profited personally. Additionally, this accounting trick is something that every Brazilian president since the restoration of democracy has used. It's really just moving funds from one sector of the federal government to another sector of the federal government, and then repaying them. It'd be like moving from the Federal Reserve to cover, Social Security, for example, Social Security checks. The fact that only about 4% of the deputies cited the reason for which the articles of impeachment listed, this accounting irregularities, sort of let you know that this was not about that. This was, how can we find a legal means to overthrow an elected government? The most cruel of these was a prominent right-wing congressman, Jair Bolsonaro, this fellow right here. He was widely expected to run for president next, and who was the favor of among the richest Brazilians, in favor. Said he was casting his vote in honor of a general who was in charge of Brazil's torture regime. A colonel was in charge of the torture regime and was personally responsible for Dilma's torture. So talk about in your face. His son, Eduardo, proudly cast his vote in honor of the military men of 64, the ones who led the coup. So these were the signs they were holding up in the Congress. Okay? So it says, "Ciao, querida," which translates into "goodbye, honey." Patronizing to the nth degree. They never wanted a woman president anyway, of course. But. So the Congress reflects a fair amount of political inequality. So you can read this statistic. So there's one federal deputy for every 263 families with land, and one federal deputy for every 612,000 landless. So it's 2,587 times greater. The same thing's true with funds. There's inequality. So for every $1,587 US that goes to assist the wealthy landowners, about $1 goes to every landless family. International capital and the national bourgeoisie. And let me quote the words of João Pedro Stedile, who's the MST leader. He says it better than I. So he says, Brazil is experiencing severe economic, political, and social crisis. And in this scenario, economic power wants to restore their profit rates. But those who hold this power are not going to get out of the crisis by themselves. For this, they need to wipe out all the social gains, take away workers' rights, privatize the power and oil companies, and implement the neoliberal project. So here's the individual. That's Michel Temer, who's the vice president. He's accused of taking 1.5 million in bribes. This is Eduardo Cunha. He's the Speaker of the House. He's an evangelical Christian and the President of the Chamber of the Speaker of the House. He's also tainted with scandal, and his taint goes back to the beginning of his career. As Subsecretary of Housing in the state of Rio de Janeiro, he was forced to resign over bidding irregularities, i.e. bribe taking, in construction contracts. Now, he is accused of stashing $40 million in bribes in Swiss bank accounts. So the players, of course, don't have clean hands, and actually probably one of the few people that untainted by scandal is Dilma herself. But I would be remiss if I didn't point out the U.S. hand in what's going on here. So At this point, there's no direct evidence of any U.S. fingerprints on the coup. However, on April 18th, the day after they voted to begin the impeachment process, Senator Nunes met with Senator Bob Corker, who is the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in Washington. He flew to Washington overnight after the vote, and then had luncheon with a Washington lobbying group headed by Madeleine Albright and former Bush Commerce Secretary Carlos Gutierrez. Nunes was also scheduled to meet with a fellow named Thomas Shannon, who some of you may know. He's like the number 3 man in the Department of State and has a long history with coups. He was instrumental in helping to consolidate the coup in Honduras. He was the State Department official that was in charge of the Venezuelan coup in 2002. So who are the pro-democracy forces? On March 31st, over 700,000 people took to the streets in the country to oppose the coup under the slogan, "We won't have a coup, but we will have struggle." The Popular Front organized nationwide to defeat forces. 200,000 people were gathered in Brazil. So these are some of the posters that you see throughout Brazil from the Popular Front. In the streets in defense of democracy is a group called Povo Sem Medo, which is people without fear. Now, these are the people that have been in the streets confronting the neo-fascist forces. And this is also from the Popular Front. We're going to continue in the streets in order to defeat the coup. João Pedro states that far from the Palácio de Planalto, which is the ministries along Brasilia, to the state of Paraná, the class struggle is been using firearms. The alliance of the oligarchs and local government that killed 2 landless workers on April 7th came in the same month as the remembrance of the 20th anniversary of the massacre. So in the rural areas, that means violence. In the halls of government, it means parliamentary coup. Thank you.